Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure. Welcome back to the program, Tim Dalton, who's Director of Professional Services at Blue Jay Solutions. And today we're going to talk about responding to tight capacity and rising costs in transportation. Now, if you go back to kind of the last summer in the middle of 2017, there were plenty of warning signs that, heading into 2018, shippers were going to face tighter capacity and increased transportation costs. So did all shippers respond to those warnings? What did, some shippers do with regards to, let's say, procurement? Did they put their freight out to bid? And what actions can, shippers take now moving forward to make sure that they're, responding as effectively as possible to the current transportation environment? Well, those are some of the questions we're going to address in today's episode. It's great to have Tim back on the program to share his insights and advice on this topic. So, Tim, welcome back.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
So Tim, like I said, I think it shouldn't have come to any surprise to shippers that things were going to get challenging in the transportation environment. I think there was a lot of signs, there was a lot of discussions taking place. Certainly by the summer of last year, that things were going to get. Capacity was going to get tight, costs were going to, go up. From your role there, at Blue Jay, I mean, did this prompt, many shippers to initiate a procurement engagement, for example, before heading into this year?
I think if anything, people were waiting. From what I saw last year, calendar Q3, Q4, it was kind of that perfect storm where we had, literally we had hurricanes, wreaking havoc and really, impacting capacity. You had the kind of the looming fear of what the ELDs were going to do, come December. You had the economy getting better, and as a result, tightening capacity, driver shortages, everything else. So like you said, the signs were there. But from what we saw is that calendar Q3, Q4, a lot of the shippers that we work with, a lot of the folks that we talk to, a lot of them weren't going out to bid. And, when I'd have conversations with those customers, a lot of them were they were afraid, it was based on the unknown. They weren't sure, what impacts everything was going to have that I had mentioned previously. They also looked at it that, if we go out to market right now, if anything, we're just asking for a rate increase from our carriers. And, it's one of those things, though, that as the year went on, and people still, or a lot of shippers still weren't quick to go to market because of those reasons. What was happening is they were finding that, their routing guides were broken. Carriers weren't living up to their commitments. More and more of their freight was going to the spot market. So even though part of the reason why they didn't go to bid was because they felt like they were going to be asking for a rate increase, in reality, they were already seeing that rate increase, but and in some situations, a higher increase than what they would have saw had they gone to bid. And if anything, in a way that was much less efficient because, their planning coordinators, their folks that were trying to find trucks, it was taking them that much longer to find one truck for one load. So rates were starting to increase, as a result. And, it was somewhat inefficient as well from a planning standpoint.
I think I kind of saw the same thing too. And I think that people, particularly second half of the year, they had their transportation budgets and forecasts that they had for 2017, right? And yep. I think to your point, there was still a lot of uncertainty in terms of what was going to, whether everything that they were hearing and seeing was, a temporary thing or whether it was going to potentially even get better, so, they were kind of hedging a little bit there, but they also didn't want to bust their transportation budgets, for 2017. So, I did see a lot of folks also, sit by the, by the sidelines there. So now we're in 2018. I mean, so has, that relatively low procurement activity, continued in Q1 of this year, or are shippers finally, putting the freight out to bid or kind of trying to see if they can fare better in this year?
Yeah. We're seeing a lot of procurement activity right now. So Q1 for shippers, for carriers, it's been pretty crazy. I think once we got to the new year, I think some people were kind of looking at it, whereas, almost taking the approach that now that the dust has settled, what am I going to do? And, they went back and they realized that, the new year didn't swing the other way. And if anything, started to look at the marketplace right now as kind of the new norm. As you know, and like we've seen all along, it's very cyclical. So it kind of goes back and forth as far as whose favor the market's in. So with that, I think people accepted the fact that it's not going to get better anytime soon. So they need to do something about it. And with going to bid, I think a lot of shippers started to realize that, if I go to bid right now, and if I compare the rates that I'm getting and the rates that I'm awarding to a baseline year over year, I'm probably losing. But if I then go back and maybe look at my baseline a couple different ways, and sure, I'm going to look at year over year just so I can understand what that financial impact is going to have. But also, they start maybe looking at a baseline to what have I spent the last 3 months, the last 6 months. I think what folks are seeing is that, year over year, they're losing, but based on what they've seen with a higher percentage of their freight going to a spot market, there's still some opportunity based on that. So, and if anything, I mentioned it before from an efficiency standpoint, if they can get their teams back to, being able to follow routing guides and trust routing guides and carriers accepting the freights as a result. So, we've seen a tremendous amount of activity this quarter. I anticipate that's going to continue. And if anything, I think that, where there was a little bit of the wait and see, middle of last year, towards the end of last year, there's a lot of procurement activity right now. And I think people are just realizing that, a procurement event isn't only about cost savings. It's one of the driving factors, and, everybody hopes to see some opportunity to see some savings when they go out to market, but it's also about getting capacity. And, if you're going deeper and deeper into a routing guide, if you were still using them, or if you were going to the spot market, it's getting harder and harder to find that capacity. And as a result, a lot of people are hearing it from their end customers, because without that consistency of certain carriers on certain lanes, they've seen dips in service as well.
That's a great point there at the end, because that's so true, and particularly in today's environment, in terms of it's not just about cost, right? It's really around that capacity assurance. And then when you look at things like, and we talked about this on Talking Logistics, last year, when you look at things like on time and full requirements from the Walmarts of the world and Targets and other customers, right, where that service component is becoming more and more important. Not having the capacity you need when you need it, and have it be reliable. It goes beyond just the cost factor in terms of what you're paying for, for a rate. And I think, the bottom line is that it's, I think shippers can't be in denial anymore that we are in a new normal, if you will, or we are in an environment that they really have to respond intelligently, to it. So, a lot of procurement engagements in Q1. I mean, can you share with us, some examples of maybe some of the outcomes that these procurement engagements had? I'm assuming, like you said, maybe the base rates did rise, but relative perhaps to what they were paying via spot, they saw some benefits there.
Yeah, I mean, from a couple examples, we had a few shippers. We had a lot of shippers early, towards middle of last year, then again late last year. When it started to go bad, we reached out to customers and worked with different customers to say, hey, there's a problem here. It's trending in the wrong direction. Let's look at a couple different things that you could do. One of those things being going to market with a procurement event. And, and as I mentioned, at first it wasn't welcomed, because again, it was thought that it was going to be a rate increase. So, last year, example, one shipper, I think it was early September, we went to them and had the conversation. They didn't want to go to market. Finally, early 2018, they decided to go to the market. But between September and the beginning of 18, they saw that approximately 30% of all their freight was starting to go to the spot market. We went out to bid recently, not all their lanes targeted, did a lot of work ahead of time to work with their carriers to understand, okay, which lanes are carriers servicing, and really let's look to see what are those lanes that are truly broken. So went out to market, and then within the first 30 days of going live with this bid, they went from 30% of their freight across their network going to a spot market, down to, I think they're about 3.6% right now. You always want that number to be at zero, but the market's still tight, and new lanes and everything else, lanes without routing guides, etc. So, they're still using it, but it's dropped significantly. And also there was for those lanes that were going to the spot market consistently of those 30%, they had found that, you know, with some of their higher volume lanes, that that they were paying a premium of about 81% compared to what their primary rate was. So the rates were ridiculous. They were across the board, so it makes it hard to plan for. And right now, with the rates that they did get back, comparing them to you know, a more recent baseline, not year over year, a more recent baseline, you know, they're finding that had they gone to market a little bit earlier, during that period of time when their spot market rose to 30%, that they could have saved approximately 6.6% month over month. So, you know, they would have still, rates are still going up. You know, it's not going to sugarcoat it and say that, you know, you're going to, year over year, you're going to save. But again, they would have been able to reduce a lot of the loss that they experienced by cutting into some of those premiums that they were paying. And then also, you know, we had another customer, you know, who has a very high profile end customer that they were working with. Started working with them early on when about 2.8% of the freight that had been on this for the specific customer on that customer's lanes were going into the spot market. They wanted to wait. Towards the end of the year, for that one customer who's a very high profile customer for a shipper that we're working with, approximately 70% of that customer's freight was ended up on the spot market. So again, higher cost, service to a very high profile customer impacted. So it caused a lot of issues. We've since done some targeted bids for that specific high profile customer for that shipper. And I think right now it's from 70, we're down to about 10% of the freight going to the spot market. So again, not where you want to be completely, but continue to make progress. It's an ongoing process right now, but we're continuing to make progress with that customer and working with everybody involved to make sure that that we're servicing the end customers, we're reducing costs where we can, but if anything, we're getting those commitments from carriers.
Yeah, two great examples there. I mean, I think my takeaway as you were talking about here, I think, you know, if you're looking at your transportation operations and you've got lanes where 30, 50, 70% of the volume is going via the spot market, I think that's a huge red flag that, you know, you're missing out on opportunities there. Yes, you know, the base rates that you're going to get are going to be higher this year relative to last year, but certainly you're going to experience you know, some cost improvements relative to what you're paying in the spot market. And just as importantly, as you mentioned, you know, particularly if you're serving, high value customers, you know, from a service perspective, you know, you're going to see some benefits there. So I didn't realize that in some cases it was that high, 70% going to spot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was kind of that waiting game. And I think if anything, kind of a general message was, you know, when you start to see it turn, it's, you know, you need to be aggressive. You got to move quick. And, you know, I think when, it was good for so long that, it was hard to make that shift to kind of put yourself back into what to expect, what to experience, and how to react in a tighter market. So I think there are some of those warning signs, like you said, they've been going on for about a year. But a lot of people looked at it as, okay, it's just doom and gloom that, you know, our carrier partners are telling us. But, you know, when it really hit, it was like, okay, now how long is it going to last? And, you know, again, I think people are realizing now that, you know, it's cyclical. It's kind of back where we're in a tight period. And how are we going to react? You can't sit and wait. You got to do something about it. So I think that's what we're starting to see now.
Right. So obviously, you know, we just talked about, you know, procurement and looking at procurement as a way to respond intelligently to what's happening with capacity and rates is one area. But beyond procurement, I mean, are there other areas where, you know, shippers that, you know, that they should focus on to reduce costs and improve, you know, service, or just be viewed as, you know, what we always talked about, being viewed as a preferred shipper in the eyes of carriers?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, procurement's not the only answer. You know, we've seen recently where, you know, there's more dialogue between shippers and carriers to say, okay, carrier, you probably know our network better than we do. You know, where are the opportunities? You know, are there certain opportunities where dedicated could work? Are there certain opportunities where, you know, paying a round trip, you know, type solution could work even if the, you know, dedicated wasn't warranted? So, you know, there's different things to work out, engage your carriers, work with your carriers. Is there something that you can do to help them to lock in capacity? maybe not for your entire network, but maybe in certain pockets or on high volume lanes. The other thing I think is that's always out there is that shippers move. There's a tremendous amount of stock transfers that go back and forth between facilities, internetwork with the shipper. And, depending on the shipper, you could have 30, 35, 40% of your spend being on these stock transfer moves. And on stock transfer moves, those are the moves where you would think that you'd have the most flexibility. So can there be something done with your stock transfers? Is there date flexibility? If you got a customer move you can't find a truck for, but you got a stock transfer that you have a truck for, and they're going to like locations, can you push out that stock transfer a couple days to utilize that truck on another load? In general, even for customer movements, what type of date flexibility do you have? Are you open to hearing from your transportation team to say, hey, can we move this load up a day? Can we push this load out a day in order to still satisfy that customer, but try to maybe try to reduce the cost or get the carrier that you want on a load on the load? Drop versus live. If you don't have a drop yard, can you have one? Are you giving that as an option to your carriers? Do your carriers know that you have a drop program? Dwell times, are you keeping your carriers? Now with the ELDs, we do for different customers, we do a lot of surveys for different shippers. And it's been interesting because a lot of the questions don't vary, every 6 months when we survey a group of carriers. And one of the questions that we always ask is, what's the highest priority to you? And it could be, quick pay. It could be, be getting in and out of a facility, carrier recognition programs, all sorts of stuff. And this past survey that we ran about a month or so ago, it was the first time that basically in and out times has rose to number one. It's the most important thing to carriers right now. They need their drivers moving. And it's one of those things that, it's something you can look at to make sure that carriers want to haul your freight, like you said, to be a preferred shipper. Utilization. Are you filling out your trucks? Especially again, those stock transfers. You should never be moving a load that's not full. So are you utilizing your trucks? Do you have proper lead time for your carriers when you're trying to tender your loads out? And again, it's just, a handful of examples of what are you doing to make sure that you're doing all that you can, but at the same time, you're doing what you can to have a choice freight for your partners.
A lot of great ideas there. And it strikes me that, number one, I think it pays to you take a holistic view of your transportation operations, right? Because I think when you start taking that, things like stock transfers and you start kind of incorporating that, viewing that in the context of everything else, you might see opportunities there, as you said, in terms of having more flexibility there in terms of, timing, in terms of maybe using some of that capacity for that you might be using for stock transfers to do deliveries and so forth. I think it speaks to the importance of, obviously TMS, which is a topic I near and dear to my heart, and I write and talk about a lot. But in terms of optimization capabilities there across your operation, in terms of visibility and business intelligence and analytics, because I mean that's really where if you're leveraging BI and analytics from your TMS, that can help reveal opportunities for improvement that can lead to, ways to better leverage the capacity you have, right?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
So, I think you mentioned this earlier. I mean, we all know that, transportation is kind of a cyclical, market, and, eventually the pendulum will, kind of swing in the other direction eventually. The only question is when, right? Is it a few months from now? Is it a year from now? 2 years from now? But it will. That's just the nature of the industry. So what can shippers do to kind of better prepare for whatever market conditions lie ahead?
Yeah, I think that it's funny because when we have these conversations, I always think like it's like Groundhog's Day, because so much of what you say you've said before, and I think it's a cyclical market. I think the biggest thing that people can do is just try to keep an appetite for change alive within their organization. Because what we've seen time and time again is that when it's quote unquote a shipper market and things are going good, there's not as much time spent looking at yourself to see what you can do to improve the process. But once it goes bad, then everybody wants to sit down and say, what can we do to improve the process so we can be a shipper of choice? And it's one of those things that, to an extent, it's kind of frustrating because it's it needs to be, something that you're looking at all the time. You need to always have that continuous improvement, because if you're only trying to improve yourself when times are bad, chances are you're going to miss the boat. Chances are the carriers are going to be taking freight for someone who was looking at it year round. So if anything, it almost seems like it would behoove a shipper to, create an internal steering committee. Let's say, have a group of people to always look to see what can they do from a trans standpoint, and include, demand planning, include CSRs, warehousing, transportation, include all the folks that are, those key stakeholders within the supply chain, and have these conversations. Look at those things on what you can do to improve your processes, to make yourself more attractive, and be willing to make those changes even when times are good, versus waiting for times to be bad. So I mean, it's, being a shipper of choice isn't only something you should be talking about when you need a carrier to haul your freight. It should be something that you're talking about just to be a good partner year round, and regardless of where we're at from a market standpoint. I think also be willing to listen to feedback to improve your problem areas. I think some other things that folks can be doing too, depending on the market that it's in, is they need to just get used to, ensuring that they're educating their organization internally. It'll save a tremendous amount of problems for you if you're continuing to educate your organization. Because one of the things that we've seen is that, things are good, and then all of a sudden things are bad. And even though you had mentioned early on in our conversation about all the warning signs that have been out there, a lot of those warning signs weren't always making their way up to, the leadership within the organization. So then all of a sudden they get their quarterly results and they start to see the financials, and as your phone's ringing off the hook because they're wanting to know, why you spent so much money or why you blew your budget in one quarter. And, part of it's because you haven't been prepping them enough. Nobody's going to like to see bad financials. Nobody's going to like to see that the budget's been busted, but it's a little bit easier if along the way you're preparing them that this is a real problem coming up and this is an issue. So, I think from an education standpoint, it continues to be key, just so people know what's on the horizon, because you don't want to wait to explain your financials, once they're public. You want to be able to kind of give people the heads up, so they understand the challenges that, the transportation in general is facing. And, I think the more that you can educate, the more that you can try to drive improvement, continuously, it'll start to ease those budget considerations. It'll start to, ease those budget adjustments, and ultimately it'll, hopefully put yourself in a position so you're actually doing what you say you're going to do, and you're being that shipper of choice, versus just trying to use it as to categorize yourself as something that you strive to be versus what you are.
I love that. It almost sounds obvious, right? But even the term itself, continuous improvement should be a continuous process, right? It should be something that's ongoing. And I think to your point, a lot of times it's more of a reactionary thing where it's only when the times get tough that shippers and others get energized, if you will, to see what can we do to improve. But certainly, you really have to live, to the term and make it a continuous process. And I think your point about, having ongoing and honest and clear communication all across the organization, with all the stakeholders involved, both within the four walls as well as externally, is important, because I think the shippers that find themselves in the toughest situation sometimes, particularly internally, is when the CFO picks up the phone and calls down to transportation and says, "What the heck's going on?" Right? Whereas that should have been a conversation that an education process that should be going on an ongoing basis. So Tim, we're running short on time here, so I'm just go to my last question here. I mean, as a way to kind of wrap up and summarize, I mean, what questions should shippers ask themselves to assess whether they're doing all that they can today to, successfully navigate, the challenges and things that they're experiencing right now in the transportation market?
I think almost just to summarize our conversation, questions that you should be asking is, are you hoping the market's going to change back, or are you going to do something about it? Are you fostering, the belief within your organization that's open to change and giving people the appetite to change? Are you looking at yourselves, year round? Are you doing that continuous improvement even when the times are good? If yes, great. If not, how are you going to start a program and then also continue it when it swings back the other way? And then also, are you doing all that you can to work with your partners to make yourself that preferred shipper? And also, are you educating your people internally? And it's those 3-4 questions. I think that if you can say yes to all, you're doing a pretty good job. But if there are if there's things that you're not doing, it's not too late.
No, great question. I think a great way to kind of summarize the conversation here. And as I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always just manage to scratch the surface. But I think you highlighted some great examples of some smart actions that some shippers have taken, particularly in the area of procurement, to better navigate through what's happening in the market with terms of capacity and rising costs. And I think it'll be interesting for us to get together, March 2019. And see, what the environment looks like then. We might be talking about, it might be a shipper's market then, and they might be, but I think at the end of the day, I think to what we discussed before, whether it's a shipper's market or whether it's a carrier's market, there are many things. A lot of the basic things that you ought to be doing are the same, right? To succeed in whatever environment you find yourself in as a shipper. So, again, thank you for making the time to be with us today, and and sharing your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me, and thanks for the opportunity, and let's do it again sometime.
Great. And thank you that joined us today. If you are watching this episode on demand, either at the Blue Jay website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or comment for Tim, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you all, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.